Joe Biden will unleash accelerated stagflation. Martin North, John Adams, in the interest of the people. Hi, John.
Hi, mate. How you going?
Not too bad, yourself?
Pretty good.
And it's a very important conversation today because, of course, the big discussion we often have is inflation, deflation, which way is it going to turn out? Biden coming in has changed the game a bit, hasn't it?
Yes, yes. So we obviously have had this deflation debate raging on for the last couple of years, and you and I had butted heads a couple of times in 2020. Now, a couple of points to make. The first one is that we did do a show in June in which I said house prices will not collapse within the next 18 months. So far, so good on that prediction. Then I started to say we're going to start to see stagflation. And we did a number of shows last year where I said, well, just to recap, what is stagflation? It is low economic growth, high unemployment, and rising prices. Stagflation happened in the 1970s in Australia, as well as in the United States and across the world. And stagflation is a conundrum for mainstream Keynesian economists because if we have high unemployment, Keynesian economists say this is because of a lack of aggregate demand. If you have a lack of aggregate demand, if demand falls, prices should fall. So when prices rise, when unemployment's rising, that doesn't fit the whole John Maynard Keynes theorem, and that really presented a huge problem for academic economists in the 1970s, and I think we're going to start to see that again. So one of the key points of evidence I cited with our show last year about Australia is that we saw a couple of quarters of negative economic growth. We obviously saw the rise in unemployment as the lockdowns were implemented across the country. And we also saw this explosion in the money supply measured in the annualized growth rate in terms of broad money. And I said, when you combine those three, that's going to be the recipe for stagflation. Now, this week, I've published a new article on my website, adamseconomics.com, and we can put that up on the screen for people to see. And now I'm coming out and saying we're going to see what I call accelerated stagflation, which is the stagflation process actually getting faster. And there's a number of key things that Joe Biden has announced even in the first 3 weeks of taking office that I think is going to accelerate this process. And obviously, as stagflation gets faster, this is going to have huge implications for our viewers and millions of people across the world.
Yeah, and I guess it's just worth pausing to say it also depends on how you measure it, right? Because there is a theory, I think probably right, that the official measure of inflation is probably significantly understated, and the underlying inflation that's really going on is probably significantly higher than the official figures would want to admit.
Yes. Look at so you and I have spoken repeatedly about the manipulation, the corruption of the CPI, the Consumer Price Index. There's been a series of methodological changes both to the American CPI and the Australian CPI. And one of the big things that happened in Australia, just to recap for our audience if they are hearing this for the first time, in 1998, the CPI was changed by removing land from the CPI. So this house price bubble in large part has been a bubble in land prices that has not been captured in the Consumer Price Index. There was a review in 1998 under the Howard government. And obviously the key historical fact is who put in the submission calling for the removal of land from the CPI? None other than our key nemesis, the Reserve Bank of Australia. So the RBA has been responsible for blowing up this bubble through extraordinary monetary policy, to taking interest rates down to zero, to quantitative easing, to providing banks with cheap in terms of cheap capital, in terms of printing money out of nothing and giving them a low interest rate, cheaper than the wholesale market. And all of this has been designed to blow up the bubble. And then as the bubble has gotten out of control, their whole modus operandi at the moment is to keep the bubble intact. And that was all what was that was all 2020 that was all about. Now, the other point I just wanted to make, Martin, just before we started talking about Biden, is one of the key points that we cited last year that was going to confirm that the stagflation process was going to take place and go underway was the announcement of, in terms of unlimited quantitative easing. I mean, we saw some big announcements last year. We saw, for example, the RBA around September, October, calling on state governments to take on or to inject $40 billion of new infrastructure spending, and they're going to finance that through QE by the RBA. That was obviously going to fuel inflation by more money printing and injecting that money into the real economy. And what we've seen, the Reserve Bank of New Zealand and the Bank of England cut rates, commit to more QE in terms of their programs as well. And obviously, when you look at the US Federal Reserve balance sheet, by August of 2019, before the repo crisis, the balance sheet shrank from 4.5 trillion to 3.8, and now we're sitting at about 7.4. So both with the repo crisis and with COVID-19, the Trump administration effectively doubled the size of the balance sheet of the US Federal Reserve. And now we are seeing some very big new commitments by the Biden administration, which I think is going to take the balance sheet to even a larger figure than where we are today. So those policies, given what Biden inherited from Trump, I think the additional stimulus at the fiscal monetary side, particularly at the federal level, at the same time of implementing a series of regulations and laws which are either going to ban certain types of economic activity, or if they're going to raise the cost of labor or business imports. And this is going to, I think, have a huge impact on employment, unemployment, and wages growth and jobs growth in America. At the same time, we're going to see a further explosion in the money supply, and that will lead to rising inflation coming forward in the United States.
I think it also depends, John, as to where that money goes, right? So I agree that the money supply has definitely increased. How much of that flows back into the financial system and the financial markets and blows up effectively stock prices and other financial instruments? How much goes back into the real economy and the implications there? I mean, those are all questions which we'll have to watch and see, I guess. But certainly the figures are eye-wateringly large, and you'd have to say that amount of liquidity that's been created one way or another is going to go somewhere.
Move on.
Well, people should be watching the interest of the people, because at least we're calling it out and we're highlighting some of these crazy decisions that are being taken and the implications, which are quite profound and frankly quite worrying. And the fact of the matter is, it's very hard to know for sure which of those two things are going to play out, right? Because both of those futures are still, I think, live. But, more evidence comes, we'll begin to actually get a better read, and you've certainly outlined some issues today. What I would say is it is very tough to try and actually manage a portfolio that is insulated on both scenarios, right? So you almost have to back a scenario and say it's more likely to be X rather than Y, deflation or inflation, because it's very hard to protect yourself against inflation and deflation, because by definition it pulls in opposite directions. And we'll pick it up again down the track. Martin North, John Adams, in the Interest of the People. We'll see you next time.